The city was a creature of two different hearts, especially when the rain began to fall. Up high in the tops of the gleaming glass towers, the rain was just a pretty pattern of lights, painting the windows with streaks of gold and white. But down on the street, the rain was cold and real. It made the pavement shine under the streetlights and sent people rushing for cover, their faces pulled tight against the wet and the chill. In the warm, quiet backseat of a car that cost more than a house, a man sat perfectly dry. He was a man used to winning, a man people listened to. His name was Elijah Vance, and his world was built on numbers, deals, and the quiet power that comes from having more money than you could ever spend. His hair was silver, not from age, but from authority, and his suit was a dark, expensive shadow against the soft leather seats. He wasn't looking at the rain. He was looking at a screen, his fingers scrolling through numbers for a new business deal. Later that night, there was a big party being held in his honor at the tallest building in the city, a building that bore his name, the Vance Tower. For him, this was just another evening, another event. He was going to the heart of his own kingdom. Just a few blocks away, the rain found another person. A young woman who had just turned 20 was trying to make herself small under a narrow shop awning. The wind blew the rain in sideways, and the cold was starting to creep into her bones. Her name was Maya, and her world was the street. She knew its sounds and its rhythms like she knew her own heartbeat. She knew when the last bus would rumble past, which restaurant put its leftover food in the green bin out back just after midnight, and which doorways were the deepest and offered the best shelter from the wind. Tonight, her home was a small, hidden space between a large dumpster and a brick wall in an alley that ran beside the mighty Vance Tower. It wasn't much, but it was out of the main flow of people, and the big dumpster blocked the worst of the wind. It was her little corner of the world, and in a life where she owned almost nothing, this small hidden spot felt important. She was smart and she noticed things. It was how she stayed safe. She saw the patterns, and tonight, a pattern was broken. She noticed a man. He was not like the usual people who walked down this side street. He was dressed in a good coat, the kind you don't see in this alley. He wasn't a businessman rushing through or a delivery person. He was just standing there near the service entrance of the Vance Tower, and he looked nervous. His eyes darted around, not like he was lost, but like he was afraid of being seen. Maya pulled her own thin jacket tighter and watched from the shadows. She saw him place a heavy-looking bag, a dark duffel bag, right against the building's foundation, tucked partly behind a low concrete ledge. He did it quickly, almost jerking his hand away from it as if it were hot. Then he straightened up, looked around one more time with a wide, frightened look in his eyes, and walked away. But he didn't walk like a man with a purpose. He almost ran, his shoulders hunched, disappearing around the far corner. A cold feeling, much deeper than the rain, settled in Maya's stomach. This was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. People didn't leave expensive-looking bags in dirty alleys. They didn't act that scared unless they had a very good reason. Her mind, which was sharp and logical, began to put the pieces together. The important building. The big event tonight. The man who didn't belong. The bag left behind. She didn't know what was in the bag. She didn't want to know. But a heavy, sickening fear began to grow inside her. She looked from the bag to the bright lights of the tower's main entrance just around the corner. She could hear the faint sound of music and see the flash of cameras. People in beautiful clothes were laughing and walking inside. That man, Elijah Vance, would be there soon. Everyone knew he was the guest of honor. Back in his car, Elijah Vance let out a small, tired sigh. The driver, a quiet man in a uniform, spoke gently. "Almost there, Mr. Vance. The media is waiting." Vance gave a short nod, not looking up from his screen. "Good, let's get this over with." He wasn't being rude. He was just focused. His world was one of constant movement, of always thinking about the next deal, the next win. He was about to step out into a celebration of his own success, but for him, it was just another step in the climb. He never once thought about the foundation of the building or the alley beside it. Those things were invisible to him. Meanwhile, Maya was fighting a war inside her own head. Her first instinct, the one that had kept her alive for months, was to stay quiet, to look away, to melt into the shadows. If she said anything, if she caused a scene, the police would come. They would ask her questions. They would look at her, a homeless girl, with suspicion. They might even blame her. It was the safest thing to do. to just pack up her few things and find another spot for the night far away from here. But then she thought about the people inside. She thought about the workers in their uniforms, the women in their dresses, the men in their suits. They were just people. They had families, friends, lives they wanted to go home to, and she thought about the bag sitting there like a silent, ugly secret against the wall. She peeked out from the alley. The rain was still falling. The beautiful people were still laughing and walking into the tower, completely unaware. And then, a long black car, sleek and silent like a shark, pulled up to the very front of the red carpet. The cameras flashed with a new energy. This was the main event. The door of the car opened and a man stepped out. He was the man from the television, the man from the newspapers. Elijah Vance. He smiled a polished public smile and raised a hand to the crowd. He was a picture of power and control. He began to walk towards the grand spinning glass doors of his tower. Maya's heart began to hammer against her ribs. It was like a loud drum in her ears. The two worlds, the one of shining luxury and the one of cold, hard survival, were about to crash into each other. Her safe, hidden corner of the world was right next to a place of terrible danger. The man in the expensive suit was about to walk into a building with a hidden bomb at its feet. Her fear was screaming at her to run, to save herself. But something stronger, something deep in her soul, told her she couldn't. She couldn't live with herself if she did nothing. She took a deep, shaky breath, her body trembling from the cold and from fear. As Elijah Vance reached out his hand, ready to push the grand door open, Maya made her choice. She stepped out of the shadows and into the light of the cameras, her voice tearing through the polite chatter of the crowd, loud and clear and filled with a raw terror that was absolutely real. The world for a single moment seemed to freeze. The sound of the rain, the chatter of the crowd, the click of the cameras, it all vanished, swallowed by the young woman's desperate shout. Her words, "Stop, don't open the door, there's a bomb," cut through the air like a physical thing, sharp and terrifying. On the red carpet, Elijah Vance had his hand outstretched, his fingers just inches from the cool metal of the door handle. The smile on his face, that practiced public expression, didn't just fade. It shattered. His body went stiff. Every thought of mergers and business deals, every bit of his carefully built confidence was wiped clean from his mind. In that frozen instant, he was not a powerful tycoon. He was just a man, his instincts screaming at him that he was in mortal danger. His head turned, his eyes wide with a confusion that was quickly turning into fear, searching for the source of the voice. The crowd didn't understand at first. There was a beat of silence, a collective intake of breath. Then someone gasped. The word bomb, once spoken, began to ripple through them like an electric shock. The polite evening suddenly felt very fragile. Before anyone could even process what was happening, two large security guards in dark suits moved. They were not thinking. They were trained to react. They did not see a heroine. They saw a threat, a disruption. The young woman, Maya, was still standing there, her chest heaving, her arm pointing a trembling finger towards the alley. She had done the bravest thing she would ever do, and now she was facing the consequences. The two men tackled her. It wasn't gentle. They drove her down onto the wet, cold pavement of the sidewalk. The air rushed out of her lungs with a painful gasp. A knee pressed into her back and rough hands pinned her arms. She didn't fight back. She couldn't. She just turned her head, her cheek pressed against the cold, wet ground, and her eyes filled with a frantic urgency, found Elijah Vance's. She managed to choke out the words again, her voice strained but clear. The alley. A bag. He left a bag. Chaos erupted. The crowd, which had been a neat, organized line of well-dressed people, suddenly broke. It became a wave of panic. Cameras dropped, drinks were spilled, and high heels clattered as people scrambled to get away from the building, from the door, from the unknown danger. The music from inside the tower suddenly sounded hollow and out of place. The scene of a perfect celebration had turned into a nightmare in less than 10 seconds. Elijah Vance was still frozen in place, but his mind was starting to work again. His eyes were locked with the young woman's on the ground. He saw the security guards treating her with brute force. He saw the pure, raw fear in her face. But it wasn't the fear of someone who was caught. It was the fear of someone who was not being listened to. She wasn't crying for herself. She was still trying to warn them. His head of security, a stern man with a graying buzz cut, grabbed his arm. "Sir, we need to move you to a secure vehicle now. We have a situation." But Vance didn't move. He pulled his arm away, his gaze still fixed on the girl. He saw past the old worn-out jacket and the messy hair. He saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the desperate need to be believed. This wasn't the look of a person causing trouble for no reason. This was the look of someone telling a terrible, urgent truth. "Wait," Vance said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the noise. "Sir, it's not safe," the security chief insisted, his voice tight with stress. "Let her up," Vance commanded. He wasn't asking. It was the voice he used in boardrooms when he had made a final decision. The guards on the ground hesitated, looking from the girl to their boss. Reluctantly, they loosened their grip and pulled Maya to her feet. She stood there, shaking, wrapping her arms around herself. She was breathing heavily, her clothes soaked from the wet pavement. Vance took a step towards her, ignoring the panicked crowd still rushing away around them. The red carpet was now just a messy, trampled rug. He stood in front of this young woman, who had just turned his world upside down. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, meant only for her. She just shook her head as if her name didn't matter. "The bag," she repeated, her voice a shaky whisper. "In the alley. A man put it there." He was nervous. "He didn't belong here. You have to believe me." The security chief was on his radio, calling in a bomb threat, his words rapid and professional. Sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder every second. Vance looked from her terrified face towards the dark opening of the alley next to his beautiful tower. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was real. This was happening. The grand party, the celebration of his success, was over. The building that was his greatest symbol of achievement was now a potential death trap. And the only person who had tried to save them all was a destitute young woman his own security had just thrown to the ground. He looked back at her. The rain was still falling, plastering her hair to her face. In that moment, the powerful Tycoon and the homeless girl were equals, standing together in the middle of a storm of their own. His life of control and order had been broken open by a single act of courage from the most unexpected person imaginable. The night was far from over. The inside of the Vance Tower was nothing like the young woman had ever seen. The panic from outside was replaced by a tense, humming silence. They hadn't gone far into the main lobby, just into a small windowless room off to the side. It was a security office with blank screens on the walls and a cold, bright light from the ceiling. The air smelled like cleaning products and old coffee. She sat on a simple metal chair, her wet clothes making her shiver. The two police officers who had brought her in stood by the door, their faces serious and unreadable. Across from her, in another metal chair, sat the Tycoon, Elijah Vance. He had refused to go to a safer location. He just sat there, his expensive suit looking out of place in the stark room, his eyes watching her carefully. The head of security, the man with the buzz cut, stood with his arms crossed. He was the first to speak, his voice hard and direct, aimed at the young woman. "Okay," he began. "Let's start from the beginning. What is your name?" She kept her eyes on the floor. "Does it matter?" she whispered. "It matters if you want us to believe you," the security chief said, his tone implying he already did not. An older police officer, a woman with a kind but tired face, stepped forward. "We just need to understand what happened, sweetheart. Can you tell us what you saw?" The young woman took a slow, shaky breath. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself, trying to stop the shivering. She didn't look at the security chief or the police. Instead, her eyes flickered up to meet the Tycoon's. He wasn't scowling or looking angry. He just looked focused. He gave a small, almost invisible nod as if to say, "Go on." So she did. She started to talk, her voice low at first but growing stronger as she remembered the details. "I was in the alley," she began. "It was just before the rain got really heavy. A man came. He was all wrong for that place." She described him. He wasn't tall, but he stood stiffly. He wore a dark coat, a good one, but it was unbuttoned even in the cold rain. Underneath she saw a white shirt, but it was untucked and messy. "His hair," she said, closing her eyes to picture it. It was dark but thin on top. He kept running his hand over it again and again like he was nervous. She described the bag. It was a dark green duffel bag, not new. It had a small faded white logo on the side, a bird maybe, or some kind of wing. It looked heavy. When he put it down, he didn't just place it. He almost dropped it, and then he jerked his hand back like the bag had bitten him. He looked around, she continued, her voice becoming more sure, but not like someone looking for a street sign. He looked scared. His eyes were wide. He was breathing fast. I could see his chest moving. After he put the bag down, he walked away, but then he started to almost run. He turned left at the end of the street and was gone. The security chief let out a short, dismissive breath. That's not a lot to go on. A man in a coat with a bag. You expect us to evacuate a city block for that? But the Tycoon held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes were still on the young woman. You said he didn't belong. What do you mean? She looked at him, and for the first time she spoke with a spark of frustration. People like him don't come to that alley. They just don't. Delivery people have uniforms. Businessmen walk fast, they have places to be. Homeless people. We move slow. We're tired. This man was different. He was there for one reason only. To leave that bag. The room was quiet for a moment. The policewoman was writing everything down. The security chief looked at his boss, waiting for him to see how flimsy the story was. Then the young woman added one more detail, the most important one. He had a tie, she said suddenly, a bright blue tie. But it wasn't around his neck. It was stuffed into the pocket of his coat. I saw the end of it hanging out, flapping when he ran. Who wears a nice coat and a shirt but carries his tie in his pocket? That detail changed the room. It was too specific. It was too strange. It wasn't something you would make up. The policewoman stopped writing and looked at her partner. The security chief's skeptical expression softened into one of thought. Elijah Vance leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. He was a man who had built his fortune on noticing the small things others missed. He understood the value of a single, precise detail. The story of a nervous man was one thing, but the story of a nervous man with a blue tie in his pocket, a man who didn't fit, a man who acted with a specific, frightened purpose, that was a different story. He looked at this young woman, shivering in her wet clothes, who had not only seen a man but had understood him. She had read his actions like a book. In that moment, he saw past her situation. He saw a sharp mind. He saw a person who paid attention because her life depended on it. Tell me, he said, his voice quiet but intense. The logo on the bag. You said a bird. Can you remember anything else about it? She closed her eyes again, concentrating hard. It wasn't a whole bird. Just a wing, I think. A white wing with 3 lines coming from the bottom. It was old. The color was scratched off in parts. The policewoman immediately got on her radio, relaying the description of the man and the bag to the units outside. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely. The young woman was no longer just a suspect or a nuisance. She was the only witness. She was the one with the answers. The Tycoon, a man who commanded rooms full of powerful people, was now listening to a homeless girl as if she were the most important person in the world. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, and he also saw the exhaustion. He saw the strength it had taken for her to speak up, and the fear of what would happen next. Get her a blanket, Vance said to no one in particular, and something hot to drink. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a human one. In that cold, bright room surrounded by chaos and fear, a connection had been made. It wasn't based on money or status. It was based on a simple, terrifying truth and the courage it took to tell it. The hot tea was in a paper cup, but the warmth felt good in her hands. The blanket someone had found was a little rough, but it was dry. For the first time in what felt like hours, the young woman stopped shivering. The simple acts of kindness from the Tycoon had changed the air in the room. The police officers were no longer standing over her. They were sitting at the small desk, talking in low voices on their radios. The security chief had left the room, his face grim. Elijah Vance sat quietly in his chair watching her. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't demanding answers. He was just waiting. The noise from outside was a distant echo of sirens and shouted orders. Inside the small room, it was strangely calm. It's real, isn't it? She asked softly, not looking at him. Yes, he said. His voice was flat. The bomb squad confirmed it. They found the bag. They're dealing with it now. She just nodded, a heavy weight settling in her chest. It was one thing to suspect, to be afraid. It was another thing to know for sure that you were right. That a thing of such terrible violence had been sitting so close to where she slept. The door to the room opened and the security chief came back in. He looked different. The anger and suspicion were gone from his face. Now he just looked pale and much older. He walked over to Vance and spoke in a low voice, but the room was so quiet they could all hear. They identified him, sir, from her description. The blue tie. It was the key detail. It's a man named Robert Haynes. Vance's head snapped up. The name clearly meant something to him. His face, which had been so controlled, showed a flicker of something. Shock and then a deep, cold recognition. Haynes, he repeated, the word sounding like a curse. You know him? The young woman asked. Vance let out a long, slow breath. He looked from her to the security chief and then down at his own hands. I fired him, he said, his voice quiet and heavy. 3 years ago, from a company I took over, I didn't just let him go. I made an example of him. I said he was inefficient, that his methods were outdated. I said it in front of his whole team. He paused, the memory clearly painful. I heard later that he never found another job like it. He lost his house. His family left him. The room was silent. The young woman listened, her tea forgotten. She saw the truth dawning on the Tycoon's face. This wasn't a random act of violence by a stranger. This was a consequence of his own actions from a time when he saw people as numbers on a balance sheet, not as human beings with lives and breaking points. He blames you, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Vance just nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The grand building, the successful company, the powerful life. It had all almost been destroyed by a ghost from his past. A ghost he had created. The policewoman's radio crackled. Suspect is in custody. He was found in his car a few blocks away. He wasn't even trying to run. He just gave up. They had caught the man. The immediate danger was over. The bomb had been safely taken away. The crisis was ending. A different kind of tension filled the room. The police officers stood up. The area is secure, the older policewoman said. She turned to the young woman. We'll need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement, but thank you. You saved a lot of lives tonight. The young woman just nodded. This was what she had been afraid of. The questions, the formalities, the bright lights of a police station. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The police led her out of the room. As she passed by Vance, she stopped for a second. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a storm of emotions, gratitude, shame, confusion. Thank you, he said. And this time the words were not from a powerful man to a poor girl. They were from one person to another. You were incredibly brave. She gave a small, tired smile and then walked out with the officers. Later, after the police had finished their initial work, Elijah Vance stood alone by the large windows of his office high up in the tower. The city lights glittered below, a kingdom he had built, but it felt hollow now. He watched as the young woman was led out of the building by the police. They weren't holding her, but they were escorting her. She was just a small figure in a blanket, walking away from the bright lights and back into the dark, rainy city. She had done this incredible thing. She had stood up and shouted a warning, risking everything. She had given them the exact details they needed to catch a dangerous man. And what was her reward? A trip to a police station in the middle of the night, and then he knew with a sickening certainty she would be right back where she started, on the street, in the cold. He thought about the man, Haynes, a man he had broken without a second thought. And he thought about the young woman who had shown more courage and clarity than anyone he had ever known, and who had nothing to show for it. The two faces swam in his mind. One, a man destroyed by his carelessness. The other, a girl saved by her bravery yet still trapped in a life of hardship. He had spent his whole life building walls of money, of power, of success, to separate himself from the chaos of the world. But tonight, a destitute girl had shouted over all those walls, and a broken man had almost blown them all up. The danger from the bomb was gone, but a new, uncomfortable truth was now sitting in the room with him, and it wouldn't be so easy to dispose of. He had been saved, but he didn't feel saved. He felt like he had just been shown a terrible and important lesson, and he had no idea what to do with it. The night was over, but for Elijah Vance, something had just begun. The morning after the bomb scare felt strange and quiet. The news channels were filled with the story, but the young woman, Maya, didn't see them. She was sitting on a bench in a gray concrete park, watching the city wake up. The police had kept her for hours, asking the same questions again and again. They had been polite, but in the end, they had given her a voucher for a cheap motel room for one night and a bus ticket. That was it. The sun was up now and the voucher was used. She was back to the beginning. She felt a hollow emptiness inside. The fear and the excitement of the night had faded, leaving her just tired. More tired than she had ever been. She had done the right thing, but the world hadn't changed. The cold was still there. The uncertainty was still there. She pulled her thin jacket tight and wondered where she would sleep tonight. A long black car, quiet and clean, pulled up to the curb near her bench. It looked completely out of place in the dusty park. Her heart jumped nervously. Was it more police? Was it someone from the news? The back door opened and Elijah Vance stepped out. He was dressed more simply today in dark trousers and a plain jacket, not a suit. He looked tired, too. He had no security with him. He just stood there for a moment. Then he walked over and sat on the far end of her bench, leaving a wide space between them. He didn't look at her right away. He just looked at the same patch of scruffy grass she'd been staring at. "Hello," he said, his voice quiet. She didn't answer. She just watched him, her body tense. "The police told me they released you a few hours ago," he continued. "They gave me this address." Still, she said nothing. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for him to offer her a check, to take a picture with her for good publicity, to do whatever rich people did to make themselves feel better. He finally turned to look at her. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said last night, after everyone was safe. I asked you why you did it, why you risked so much to warn us," she remembered. She had given him a simple answer. "Your answer," he said, as if reading her mind. "You said, because it was the right thing to do." He shook his head, a sad smile on his face. "I have spent my entire life making decisions. Millions of them. I decided which companies to buy, which people to hire, which buildings to build, but I almost never stopped to ask if what I was doing was the right thing. I only asked if it was the smart thing, the profitable thing." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "That man, the one who left the bomb, I destroyed his life because it was the smart thing for my business. I never saw his face. I never thought about his family. I created that problem. And you solved a problem you didn't create, just because it was the right thing to do. It made me realize that I have been living my life all wrong." He reached into his pocket. She stiffened, expecting a wallet, but he pulled out a single small key. It was an old, simple key, not for a car or a fancy house. "This," he said, placing it on the bench between them, "is for an apartment. It's small. It's nothing special, but it's safe and it's warm and it has a lock on the door. It's yours for as long as you want it. No strings attached." She stared at the key, not daring to believe it. It sat there on the worn wood of the bench, looking both ordinary and miraculous. "But that's not the offer," he said, and now he leaned forward a little, his eyes serious. "The apartment is just so you have a place to think, so you are not making decisions from a place of fear and survival." She looked from the key to his face. What is the offer?" "I have spent 30 years building an empire of things," he said. "Buildings, companies, money. But last night I saw that it's all hollow. It can all be gone in an instant. What you have, your courage, your clarity, your sense of what is right, that is real. That is something you can build on." He took a deep breath. "I am starting something new. A foundation. Not just to give away money, but to actually help people, to find smart ways to fight homelessness, to give people second chances, to help before they get so desperate they do terrible things. But I don't know how to do that. I only know how to make money." He looked directly at her, his gaze intense and honest. "I want you to help me. I want you to be my partner, to be the heart of it, to tell me what is right and what is just a smart business decision that hurts people. I will provide the resources. You will provide the truth." The young woman was speechless. The world seemed to tilt on its side. An apartment was a dream. But this was a purpose. He wasn't asking her to be a recipient of his charity. He was asking her to be his guide. She looked down at the key. Then she slowly reached out and picked it up. The metal was cool in her hand. It felt solid. It felt real. "I don't know anything about running a foundation," she whispered. "Neither do I," he said. "Not a real one. We will learn together. But you know what people need. You know what it feels like to be invisible. That is the knowledge we need most." She closed her fingers around the key, feeling its edges press into her palm. She thought about the long, cold nights, She thought about the fear in people's eyes last night. She thought about the chance to make sure fewer people felt the way she had felt. She looked up at him and gave a single firm nod. "Okay," she said. "Okay." The scene that followed was not in a boardroom or a fancy office. It was months later, at the opening of a new community center in a part of the city that was often forgotten. There was no red carpet. There were no cameras from fancy news channels. There were just people from the neighborhood, curious and hopeful. The Tycoon and the young woman stood together, but not at the front. They were off to the side, watching families walk in. He was no longer in his power suits, just simple, comfortable clothes. She stood tall, her eyes bright with a new kind of confidence. She was no longer the girl from the alley. She was the director of the foundation, and she knew the name of every person who had helped design this place. He looked at her and smiled. "We did it," he said. "No," she replied, shaking her head with a small smile. "We're just starting." The Tycoon who had once frozen at the truth of a bomb threat had finally opened the door to a different kind of life. And the young woman who had once had nothing but her courage now had a key, not just to an apartment, but to a future she was helping to build. Their worlds, once so far apart, had found a common ground. And on that ground they were planting something new, something that was not just smart, but right.